Well, welcome to this Threads event. This is sponsored by the Thriving Pastors Initiative here at Beeson Divinity School, and periodically we have these events to focus on some aspect of pastoral life and ministry that we can learn from and encourage one another in as we seek to thrive together in ministry. And the focus that brings us together today is the opportunity to reflect on the thriving life and ministry of Tim Keller. And we're blessed to have Collin, Hansen, author of the book on Keller and his life and ministry, just recently released, to come and speak with us today about that and to offer some focused reflections on that matter of how Keller thrived across the years in his life and work. And we're thankful for the way the Lord used him in his ministry to impact so many lives and to impact the church and the cause of Christ in so many places over the years. I think Collin's known to many of us already. He is Vice President for Content and Editor-in-Chief at the Gospel Coalition. He is also Executive Director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He leads regular podcast called Gospel Bound, and is the author and contributor to several books. And he is co-chair of the Beeson Divinity School Advisory Board and has periodically taught for us here in the area of cultural apologetics. And we're very thankful for Collin, and I thank him for being willing to speak today in this time. Let me lead us in a word of prayer, and I'll turn things over to Collin. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your faithful provisions in so many ways. We thank you for this good food you've provided for us. We thank you for the fellowship that we have and share together here today and in the work of ministry. Father, we ask that you would bless this time, use it to build up your body. Use this, Father, to fit us more for the work of gospel ministry. We thank you for the life and witness of Tim Keller and pray that you might use his witness as a ministry to us today. Through Christ we ask it. Amen.
It is so wonderful to be able to be here. I made the long commute all the way up from the third floor to be here today. I can't think of a better subject and a more appropriate venue, not only here at Beeson Divinity School, but within the Thriving Pastors Initiative. And I have no doubt that I probably came up with the idea of this book in part because of my time here at Beeson Divinity School. Just being up there hanging around this place since 2012. And being serving since the inauguration of our advisory board with Dean Timothy George, one of my mentors and one of my role models in ministry. So being able to talk about one of my role models in ministry, in Tim Keller, in a context of a school that Timothy George built, and now being led by one of my mentors from seminary at Trinity, Doug Sweeney, is really a special privilege. There are so many different fun aspects that we can go into here talking about Tim Keller, because I'm not sure, whenever you're an author and you're setting out to write a book, you want the book to be similar enough to other stuff that sold well so that people might actually buy your book, but different enough that people will think that they have to buy your book and not just read something else. And you guys are such a learned group that perhaps you can help me with this, but I didn't find anything that is a close parallel to what I did in more or less dissecting the life, spiritual formation, and ministry of a contemporary pastor. One of the problems that we have historically with any number of major figures Augustine is probably the easiest that we can do this, but of course most of what we get from Augustine is from himself, sort of pioneering that genre in the Confession. So we do know more about Augustine than we know about practically anybody else in that period. Probably one of the reasons why Augustine's studies are flourishing in so many ways still today. But when you consider a Jonathan Edwards or a John Calvin or any number of thriving pastors throughout history, you don't necessarily have that kind of outside contemporary perspective that not only looks at that, kind of dissects that ministry life from an outside perspective, but by talking directly from that source as well to say, what were you thinking? Where did this come from? What were you looking at in this? And so one of my most fervent hopes with this book is that I would be able to help ministry leaders and pastors in particular to be able to see what a thriving ministry life is like. Now, Tim Keller, personality-wise, I guess I never met Augustine, so I can't quite say for sure. But Tim is the opposite of whatever that personality would be. He would not have ever written an autobiography. It was hard enough for me to convince him to cooperate with me on this book on his spiritual and intellectual formation. Just did not like to talk about himself. So part of the methodology of this book was talking to all the other people around him before I ever talked to him. So looked at all of his writings, listened to those sermons, and then talked to all these other people around him before I talked to him. So Tim did not like to talk about himself, but he loved to talk about what he was learning. Always loved to talk about what he was learning, and he was always learning. We do, however, in his spiritual intellectual formation, get something that is a hidden autobiography. One of the first interviews I did, somebody said, well, you know, he really did disclose what is as close as it gets to his autobiography. He just didn't say the autobiography of Tim Keller. He called it The Prodigal God. His book, The Prodigal God, one of his best sellers. If you want to understand the significance of that book and those spiritual dynamics to Tim Keller's life, all you need to do is look at the program from his memorial service, and you'll see the front of it is no picture of Tim Keller. No picture of Tim Keller anywhere to be found, for that matter. And I asked his son recently, was the decision to not bury him in a place where anybody could find him, was that reminiscent of John Calvin? You know, the unmarked grave, something like that. I don't think so. But the point is, did not like to draw attention to himself. But the front of that piece, of that memorial service program is Mako Fujimura, one of his close friends, longtime elder at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, his painting, Prodigal God, in honor of Tim. Now, you may know, this book then gives us an interesting insight into Tim's intellectual, spiritual formation, and ultimately his thriving ministry. You probably know about Tim's famous interpretation of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. It's important to note that in this book, two different things I talk about. One that was not original to Tim. He borrowed that from others, including his only personal mentor in life, Ed Clowney from Westminster Theological Seminary. That's number one. Though typical for Tim, he had new adaptations of it for psychological and spiritual understanding. So in the way that Ed looked at it, it was more broad. Jack Miller had some of these dynamics as well, but Tim really looked at it from a psychological and sociological perspective on top of the biblical precedent in there. But one of the things the second thing is that this is unique in the book. In fact, I don't know if the people closest to Tim knew this or recalled it. I recognize that, and not many people know this or knew this before the book, but Tim's younger brother, he had one younger sister and younger brother, died of AIDS. He had been gay, and he died of AIDS in the 1990s. And I said, well, did Tim preach the funeral? And yes, he did preach the funeral in the late 1990s. I said, well, I have to know what he preached. And I asked him, this is typical of how this process went. I asked him, and Tim said, I've got a recording somewhere, but it's in boxes in storage, so good luck. I wasn't going to get it. Thankfully, his assistant, I consider this a divine answer to prayer, his assistant said, I've got the transcript right here. And so what's interesting is that this is, as far as I could tell, the first time he ever preached the parable of the prodigal son, at least this way, at the death of his younger brother. And what's interesting also that was just emotionally powerful for me, if you get a chance to listen to the audiobook version that I recorded right up here on Shook Hill, basically, on 280, I get very emotional talking about it because one of the things Tim discusses in the parable of the prodigal son is that one thing that's in the background of the story is that it would have been the older brother's responsibility to pursue the younger brother and to bring him home. And Tim, of course, I get choked up even thinking about it now. Tim, of course, talked about how Jesus is that older brother who came for us to save us in our sins. But there's many layers of interpretation here and understanding as Scripture in our lives attest to. And what I found, though, was that in Tim's younger brother's life, that was the role that he had played. That in his brother's hospice care, he had gone to preach the gospel, share the gospel with his younger brother, who then did come to the Lord at the end of his life. And part of the dynamic that I tried to uncover about what was the nature of the spiritual power in Tim Keller's life that's so palpable in his teaching, in his writing, in his leadership, was in part that dynamic experience of grace. And it was seen in some ways through Tim, but also especially visible through his younger brother. Because his younger brother had, I can't remember if it was 7 years younger, just off the top of my head, but his mother, the Keller's mother, had switched churches toward the end of Tim's life. Very tumultuous 1960s period. And so Tim had a Lutheran pastor who was more conservative and taught him that the Kellers are Germans, so this Lutheran background. And a Lutheran pastor who had taught him the basics of the gospel. First time he ever heard a basic gospel presentation was from his Lutheran pastor in confirmation. But the next year, a young pastor just out of Gettysburg College had showed up, and that pastor had no interest in the gospel and very little interest in Scripture, but was very much enamored with social activism of the 1960s. And so ultimately the family decided to leave that church. And they went to a holiness-oriented, what we would describe as probably a quasi-fundamentalist in some ways, churches. And the experience was Tim's younger brother would walk forward. He'd walk down the aisle every single week. Every single week. But the thing is, for his entire life until the very end, he never understood the basic dynamic of grace. It just did not click with him at all. And so it's an interesting dynamic because you might associate the younger brother in this real life story of Jesus' parable with the one who runs away, he's gay, he dies of AIDS. That's the younger brother who flees from home. But the essential problem, as Tim taught so many of us, was the problem is both brothers. And the problem is grace in both cases, an unwillingness to give it and to accept it. And for the older brother in particular, also an unwillingness to understand it and to accept it for himself. There, so you see in this story so much of the spiritual dynamics that are at the core of this thriving ministry. Both of the sons are lost in that story. One of the things that is evident in Tim's life was that he personally represented and understood and connected with both aspects of the story. Now, he often would talk about New York City as the place where, and I think he would sometimes even use Birmingham as a place, or a place like Birmingham. He'd say, the younger brothers grow up in Birmingham and they move to New York to get away from their families. So he often would talk about that kind of dynamic of ministry, that they're often ministering to those people who have fled home. They've fled religious backgrounds. They've fled the church. But there's also an interesting dynamic that I wrote about extensively in the book, and I alluded to it earlier with Mako Fujimura. The dynamic that was so thriving in Redeemer Presbyterian Church is that this is a congregation that reached the older brothers who tended to be the investment bankers on Wall Street in the boom of the 1980s, but also the younger brothers of the artists and the artist communities, the more expressive types. So that was not only something that Tim could understand, but his ability to be able to emotionally and spiritually access these feelings and experiences of different kinds of people, and ultimately through his extensive counseling training, especially through Christian Counseling and Education Foundation, CCEF, really put a heavy priority on preaching to the heart and developing applications for different kinds of people in the same place. And that's one of the dynamics that you see that was so thriving in Tim Keller's ministry. I wanted to situate Tim within his historical context. I did things like try to listen to what were all the top shows or top songs in 1968 when Tim was going off to college, just to inhabit that moment. The top song, just in case you're interested for trivia, top song when he started college was "Hey Jude" from the Beatles. So pretty big deal there. It's 1968. It's Woodstock. The backdrop here, of course, is the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, the riots in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention, one of the, if not the most tumultuous eras of the 20th century in the United States, along with certainly World War II. That's the dynamic there. But also, Tim was, the way he expressed his sort of younger brother aspect in running away from the faith early on, is essentially, especially what his church and his family had taught him about race, was he found to be wrong. He found to be offensive. So one of the things that, as many of you who have done my classes know, that we start off with a personal statement of disenculturation. And part of this is what happened in Tim's life. He was disenculturated by stepping out of his upbringing into college. He began to look back on his Christian upbringing and realize, my family was flat wrong when it came to their views on race and civil rights. They were wrong on their views about grace and holiness. But part of that's what allowed him to thrive in ministry, was being able to step out of his experience and look back and see God's hand in it, but to be able to make necessary corrections according to Scripture. He started doing that early on in college. It was part of his conversion. But of course, he would ratify this professionally through his learning from Richard Lovelace and his Dynamics of Spiritual Life. I just watched for the first time, coming back from Europe recently, the Jesus Revolution movie. I'm sure some of you have seen that one. I really enjoyed it, from the Irwin brothers here, longtime Birmingham folks. But one of the things that we take for granted, and a lot of people don't realize this, hopefully they realize it in the book, but Tim is a product of the Jesus Revolution, the Jesus movement, that Jesus revival. That was exactly dead center in what his experience was. And also for his wife, Kathy, as well. So, but the basic question was essentially, can there be this kernel of gospel truth that transcends all cultures, but allows us to get out of this enculturation that everything has to look a certain way with a certain dress and certain music and certain rules? We take for granted that, of course, that's how we understand things today. But one of the major reasons we understand that things that way today is because of the teaching of Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell. This was his primary contribution of what it means to disenculturate from that background and reinculturate, but with a priority on the gospel of jumping back into a culture. Tim Keller was a product of that. But he combined it in a way, essentially, though, one of the problems of that Jesus movement is that people often tended to experience grace for the first time outside of the church. And so Tim looked back and said, I didn't find any grace in the church. So he thought, but I found it at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So apparently I have to leave the church to be able to find this. Well, it was Ed Clowney who taught him, as he's taught many of us through his works that were assigned to me when I was in seminary, to recognize the special work of God and the particular calling within the local church. So that's what sort of brought him back in. In fact, it was shortly after Tim Keller's conversion. It's a good way of describing Tim Keller's thriving ministry, his spiritual and intellectual formation, is that they bring in Ed Clowney. And I just love that this well-known, famous professor from Westminster Seminary decides to go teach a small retreat of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at Bucknell. I'm heading to Bucknell next week, I think, to talk about Tim Keller. It is not easy to get there. It is not an easy place to access. I got to drive 3 hours from the airport to be able to get there. It's not easy. But what he did is he opened up, Clowney had studied at Wheaton College undergraduate, but he had done graduate work at Yale on existentialisms, particularly of Kierkegaard. And so they brought in Ed Clowney to be able to do basically what they would have described, or what we would describe now as cultural apologetics. He was addressing the existentialism of Albert Camus. Camus was a major figure in 1968, and so he came in to address that. So it's a good example of Tim Keller's life. He learns from Ed Clowney teaching on the existentialism of Albert Camus, but showing the hopelessness of it, and then pointing to the gospel of Jesus Christ at an evangelistic meeting that's packed out at Bucknell. And then from there, he goes to an InterVarsity retreat weekend where they talk about the God's plan in the local church. And Tim's thought was, I don't want to go to a retreat on the church. Who cares about the church? But his mind was transformed through that, and it set him on that trajectory. Interestingly, Tim Keller was not reformed at the time, so Clowney said, you don't want to go to Westminster, where I teach. Instead, you should go to Gordon Conwell, this new seminary where you're going to learn from a lot of different perspectives. So that's where he became reformed. but didn't start out that way. What you'll see so much, and what I think is absolutely vital to Tim Keller's thriving ministry, and what really helped me in the writing of this project, and I've still got the files upstairs in my office, but one of the things that stands out from Tim Keller throughout, and this is one thing that overlaps so much with the mission and vision of Beeson Divinity School, is the significance of community, the significance of friendships. One of the things that I actually hoped, and I've got Paul House's voice somewhere in the back of my head here, was that people would see what kind of work God can do to transform seminary experience in a spiritual and intellectual way together is when you do it residential and when you do it in community. So unlike here, unfortunately, like they actually lived on campus as well. So they're eating all their meals together. One of the things that Tim had instructed, I talked with one of Tim and Kathy, his wife, one of their best friends, Louise Midwood. She supplied me with any number of really extremely helpful and even historically valuable documents from that period. But one of the things that Tim had said, this is a book on thriving ministry, on spiritual and intellectual formation. He said to her, make sure that Collin puts in the book how we would laugh so hard together that we would spit, fling milk out of our nose, over meals together. It just spoke to the significance of that group. And I write about it in the book, the Edmund P. Clowney Fan Club, of 4 people in there, 2 guys, 2 girls, and ultimately they went from being a best friend group of 4 to being 2 couples, and ultimately remained best friends for the rest of their lives. David died of cancer back in about 2014 or so, and of course Tim then this year as well. But what I tried to capture in the book was the dynamic of the way when you, and Tim talked about this for the Gospel Coalition in 2014, but he said when you examine I'll say a thriving minister, you should be able to cut them like an oak tree and be able to investigate the rings, to be able to look at the rings. And that became the controlling metaphor for me in the book, because I thought it was so helpful to see that a thriving minister would look like this sturdy oak over time. The core is always the core. The core is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it didn't matter if you were talking to Tim Keller as a seminary student, as a college student after his conversion, or all the way until his deathbed this year, you would have heard the same basic appeal to the gospel. And as you guys know from Tim's work, for him that would have taken a very strongly reformational shape. It would have taken a very strong justification by faith alone strain that would be very recognizable within our reformational tradition. But that would have been what he understood to be the very core. But what I tried to illustrate through the book is how he remained steady, but also curious. So rooted, but also expansive. One of the things, and I'll say this just because I know Beeson so well, I've been a seminary student, I understand this. One of the challenges of seminary, and just of ministry in general, is that it can be very faddish. It can be very much like, everybody this day loves this person, or this tradition, or this idea. And in some ways, this is a seminary rite of passage. Don't feel bad if you're first year or second year. Like, you kind of just have to get it out of your system. I understand that. But there's a sense in which it's good to be settled in a tradition. It's good and necessary. At Beeson, we're not trying to educate ministers to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this, but instead to be very rooted in who they are and in their tradition, but to be open in understanding and learning from other Christian traditions who have a lot to offer, even if we don't agree with them on everything. And Tim Keller is a very good example of what that looks like. And so what it allowed him to do, and this is, by the way, one of the areas that people misunderstand him the most. They misunderstand him the most because they'll enter in to Tim Keller on ring 85. And they don't ever bother to penetrate to the core and to get to rings 1 to 5. So this is one of the challenges that I have teaching cultural apologetics, because A lot of that was really focused in the last 10 years of his life. He doesn't start preaching about Charles Taylor until about, I think it was 2013 maybe, the first time he brings him up. And a lot of what he and I started together at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics is built off helping the church to prioritize these aspects of deep learning from social criticism. But the problem is if you just enter Tim Keller through the social criticism, or you just enter him through the missiology, then you easily can miss the gospel core. You can miss all the years that he spent reading those Puritan paperbacks from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. You can miss the whole George Whitefield phase that he had when Kathy said, you need to stop reading George Whitefield because you just keep saying George Whitefield things in your preaching. Like he did have a lot of those fads, but he turned those fads into rings on a tree that allowed maturity. So interestingly, as a thriving minister, and Tim would often say this because as Tim became more well-known and as our cultural climate and political climate changed, people would often accuse him of all kinds of different changes or liberalism or any number of things. But I can attest, and the book is a testament to this, that basically everything he believed was there in seminary. Really didn't change after that. So in some ways, seminary is exactly the place where you work this stuff out. He changed to become a Presbyterian. He changed to become Reformed. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't use seminary as a time to do that. I'm just saying the ultimate goal we're working toward in maturity and in thriving ministry is that dynamic of being settled in who God has called you to be, but curious throughout the remainder of your life. Settled but curious. And I think you get that in Tim Keller. One of the things that I would use to describe him in his thriving ministry is he was non-anxious. He was not an anxious person. In all of these conversations that I had with him over the years working together, he was extremely reluctant to the point where I'm not sure I can recall a single time when he criticized somebody else to me. Given our line of work together, that's pretty miraculous. Was not interested in that. And also, especially when he took a lot of criticism in the last year or so, his responses to me were fairly consistent. They were simply, you need to understand who to listen to with criticism. And just because a lot of people are mad at you on Twitter doesn't mean that that's indicative of anything you should be responding to. And this is one thing that I think is a challenge, and I see generationally sometimes, is that younger pastors are coming up in an environment where these different social dynamics and media dynamics are much more ever-present and pervasive. And I think one of their tendencies is to sometimes overreact to that kind of criticism and under-attend to their responsibilities before God, and ultimately have that non-anxious presence, which is one of the most effective things we can do to embody the presence of Christ in an era, especially with younger generations, that are just struggling so badly with anxiety, sometimes diagnosed, sometimes of the biblical variety that Jesus talks about in there. And so Tim Keller really, in so many different ways, embodied that non-anxious presence. There's a lot of things that I could talk through in here, but I want to make sure to give a good bit of time for questions, because that's what I love to do with you guys, and I want this to be participatory. But I've got just sort of 5 takeaways that we can work through of what we can learn in terms of thriving ministry with Tim. And the first one is simply to not judge the potential in young leaders too quickly. And I'm so excited to be having this discussion because seminary is exactly the place to be talking about Tim Keller. He gave me a proposed outline for the book where he was saying, well, Collin, why don't you just break my life down into different decades? And I said, I'm not going to do a 2020s decade the same length as your seminary decade, because your seminary decade deserves about 7 chapters in this book, which is what you'll see in this book. I think I might have 3 chapters just devoted to what he learned in seminary. So the amazing thing is that, and I don't know if you're the head of the class or if you're the caboose of the class, I'm not quite sure. But Tim Keller was just not impressive in seminary. I don't think there's any other way for me to be able to say that. I think there's another interesting dynamic with Tim Keller that for the I think what we remember him for is helping, and I think probably, I kept thinking, what would you say as the first line of his obituary? Nobody did more among evangelicals in the West to prepare them in his generation for a global, multicultural, and urban future. A globally multicultural and urban future. But the fascinating thing is that for the first 35 years of Tim Keller's life, which includes more than a decade of ministry, there were three things he had no experience with: global, multicultural, or urban ministry. He didn't have any experience. There's no way you would have looked at his life and thought, here's this guy who grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where his family had been in Bucks County for centuries, who then went to Bucknell, a small liberal arts school in central Pennsylvania, who then went up to Boston, and which indulged his egg-headed tendencies in ministry, who then went to this down-and-out Hopewell, Virginia. I had to put the picture in there just so people would believe me. The self-proclaimed chemical capital of the South. Wonderful title there for your city, Hopewell, Virginia, the chemical capital of the South. Basically a DuPont factory town in there is in a congregation of 100 people, most of whom did not have beyond a third grade education, if I can recall correctly. Several of them whose fathers had fought in the Civil War. There were two college degrees in the congregation. Both of them were elementary school teachers. He learned right off the bat that whatever he'd learned at Gordon Conwell basically didn't translate. What I meant by that, though, is that essentially what he was looking for was he thought that I'm in an academic context, I've been in academic communities. The way to help people grow spiritually is through studies. It's through basically a classroom type setting. Had no understanding at the time that in a working class environment that was not a wise course of action. The point is, you just would not have seen any of that potential in him. You would not have seen him as most likely to succeed in his seminary class. He was not the most outspoken student. Professors did not, Gordon Conwell still does this today. They'll award scholarships to their teaching assistants, and they'll be recognized publicly as sort of like the most prominent students on campus. It's not really Beeson's culture. We don't really do things like that in the same way. We award them, but we award you at the end of your time. There are some other seminaries. Southern Seminary stands out. They kind of do more of this. You kind of know who the really good students are. They're recognized even from the very beginning. Boy, you would not have put Tim Keller in that category whatsoever. You may have heard this, but be encouraged. Tim got a C in his preaching class. Maybe he would have done better with Dr. Smith. I'm not really sure, but he got a C in his preaching class. Tim's lack of recognition came with it something that was very painful to him. None of them wanted, and Beeson's very different in this regard, but nobody wanted to mentor him. They just didn't see enough potential in him to be able to mentor him in there. That was hurtful to him. After seminary, I mentioned earlier, Tim and Kathy didn't know if they were going to be able to find a job, so they took the civil service exam to become postal carriers with the U.S. Postal Service. I told you that for the book, I talked to all of the people around Tim. I talked to with his best man at his wedding. By the way, R.C. Sproul did the ceremony for Tim and Kathy. But his best man told me they must have been desperate. And I said, well, I mean, sure they were. They were studying to carry the mail. Of course, Tim and Kathy were desperate. And this is the kind of thing that only the best man at your wedding can say. He said, no, I mean the church that took Tim and Kathy for a 3-month appointment must have been desperate because they were that unimpressive. They were that unimpressive. Folks, ministry is a long game, at least until Jesus returns. Ministry is a long game. Do not give up on young leaders if they don't make the best first impression, because you don't know when they'll blossom. Also would point out here that between the ages of 57 and just until last year, essentially no one has done more to be able to, basically produced an entire library full of absolute evangelical classics than Tim Keller. I'm going to jump ahead to a couple of these because I think I want to give more time for questions in here. So I'll have to give you the other two some other time. But this is, I think it would be, these are, I think, the most important that we can also take away. Number 4 is again, I skipped 2 and 3. Number 4 is to never stop learning. I've already looked at this, but I want to give a concrete example of what this meant for Tim's thriving ministry. I mentioned there at age 57, that's when Prodigal God and The Reason for God became bestsellers. And that's wonderful that they, none of us probably will ever be able to experience that kind of publishing success or ministry fame. Tim did not enjoy that fame. It didn't fit his personality very well. If you compare Tim Keller and Billy Graham, both thriving ministries, my first book I ever worked on was a book about Billy Graham, who I love. He's a great hero, one of the founders of Gordon Conwell, of course, where Tim had studied. But Billy Graham leveraged his amazing good looks, his amazing personality, his beautiful wife, all that sort of stuff, saying, the more famous I become, the more famous I can make Jesus. Not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that. There's a long tradition of that within American evangelicalism. Tim took the opposite approach, the utterly opposite approach, which was his personality. Kathy, to this day, is allergic to fame and attention. And if you saw the memorial or you watched any of that, I think you could see that pretty obviously come through with her in there. But the aspect here is that for the thriving ministry, Tim he never stopped learning and growing. So when at 57 he published his first 2 bestsellers, he's realizing my apologetics book is outdated. It's not even what I should have been publishing. So imagine that everybody is lauding you, saying, you are the next C.S. Lewis, who, by the way, is one of his top 2 heroes with Jonathan Edwards, okay? So everybody's telling you, you're the next C.S. Lewis, and you're thinking, this isn't even what I should be writing anymore. What he had done, I mentioned community earlier, the lifelong community. I want you, especially for those who are students here right now, even if you're a pastor in ministry, I want you to continue to pursue that and to build that community. It was really this group called the Dogwood Fellowship with James Davison Hunter from the University of Virginia, another pastor, Skip Ryan, and 2 businessmen, Don Flo and Jim Seneff, who got together to do deep, challenging study. Especially if you're in ministry and when you leave ministry, you're going to need some friends to challenge you to read some of the books that you need to keep reading, but you don't have the accountability anymore from your classes and your professors to be able to do. So find those other people in ministry who will continue to challenge you in that. So Tim Keller, with Reason for God, decided then to go back and wrote what is really the sort of signature text with which we launched the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, and that's his 2016 book, Making Sense of God. Just to give you a sense of context of how quickly some things can change in ministry and why we do what we do at the Keller Center is because in 2008, actually in Dr. Chateau's class recently, evangelism class, I asked about this, but in a 2008 apologetics book, there's not a single chapter on sexuality. There's no chapter on sexuality in Reason for God. That will help you to understand a bit of the problem there. Still a good book, but it just shows you how in ministry you've got to keep challenging yourself. You've got to keep learning. And I think Making Sense of God, despite it being published 7 years ago, is probably still a significantly forward-thinking text for our times. So the best teachers can coast. And I think in some ways, maybe the lesson that I'm trying to draw here is sometimes acclaim or encouragement is one of your biggest threats in ministry. As Ray Ortlund would say, none of us is ever over-encouraged in ministry, but if it allows you to become complacent and to stop studying God's Word especially, but also studying other important texts like you've been taught in seminary, that becomes a threat to your ongoing relevance and growth in ministry. And the last thing I'll say before questions then is simply, I think this is where Tim would want me to stop, is to keep pressing for a deeper experience of God. That is the ultimate source of a thriving ministry. There's no other explanation whatsoever for that thriving ministry. You can actually, I think, hear this audibly But maybe you'd have to know Tim to be able to see it. But I did an interview with him in 2000 and early 21, and I noticed that he sounded different, just sounded different. Oddly enough, pancreatic cancer had been something of a liberation from him. Ministry's hard. He just about burned out after his first 9 years at Hopewell. New York just about took him out a couple different times with bad administrative challenges. Tim was not a gifted administrator. That's one of my other points. Find other people, empower them where you're weak. But it just about took him out a couple different times. But he said to me that he lived under this gloom of what tomorrow would bring, all his responsibilities that tomorrow would bring. Or you might experience it differently, especially if you've been a pastor for a while. You live in a sort of gloom of what the next email is going to entail. Because you just know what it's like as a pastor. The next email could be anything from some dear member of your congregation has a terrible cancer diagnosis. One of your good friends is leaving the church. Somebody else is mad about your sermon. You just know that sometimes there's an anxiety level that builds with your inbox. That's a lot of what Tim Keller experienced as well. But what allowed him to thrive, oddly, and what liberated him was a recognition of the reality and the imminence of eternity. And there's really nothing different of what Tim Keller experienced through pancreatic cancer, the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, than what Jesus has told the rest of us, which is exactly that antidote to anxiety, which is to understand that we can cast all of our cares on Jesus Christ. He's the only one who can carry them. And beyond that, we don't know what tomorrow will bring either. None of us in this room knows what tomorrow will bring, which is not meant to induce anxiety, but instead to induce trust on the one who does. And that's the liberation, I think, that Tim Keller experienced there at the end of his life, telling me, I'm not fighting my cancer, I'm fighting my sin. And the day before he died, Tim Keller told his family, I'm thankful for the time God has given me, but I'm ready to see Jesus. Send me home. And so my encouragement, more than anything else, for thriving in ministry is to prepare for eternity. It's coming soon for all of us and for everybody that we care for in ministry. And that is when we will truly and fully thrive in who God created and redeemed us to be. And it'll be more glorious than we can imagine. So let's take some questions. Got a little over more 10 minutes to be able to hear from folks.
Could you please tell us a little bit more about the prayer services that you mentioned in your book, and especially Redeemer at the very beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about the prayer services. So one of the most important things to mention about the prayer services is that Tim wasn't there in those prayer services. So what I'm referring to specifically is a group, and I don't think this is a coincidence, but I wrote about it in one of my books, A God-Sized Vision, about the Korean revivals of the early 20th century. And especially as Redeemer would continue, Koreans would compose a significant part of the population to the point where Asian Americans would be actually a majority of Redeemer Presbyterian Church. But one of the things that was part of the kind of the culture there, and it came from a lot of different sources. It came from Jack Miller with like that sort of kingdom expanding, huge prayers. It came from Harvey Kahn and the love for the city, the prayers of like, we can pray that God will make our city a better place for everybody. So one of the things that the early members of Redeemer Presbyterian Church would tell me is that, you remember all that stuff about the decrease of crime in the 1990s in New York City? Remember that stuff about how everybody after 9/11 didn't move away from New York City? Yeah, that was God answering our prayers. That's what we were praying for. The original round-the-clock prayer idea came in response to the war, the first Gulf War in 1991. But again, I wanted to put it in that context because it also extends back to, I mentioned Edwards as one of Tim's heroes, the concerts of prayer that were typical of that period as well. So I think prayer is an underdeveloped concept in my book. So thanks for giving me a chance to highlight more of that, some of those dynamics. But I think it's very important to note that that was a culture that he inculcated, but that interestingly, he was not there present for all those times. So it's interesting, when those members of Redeemer would talk about the church, they talked about Tim's preaching and those times of prayer and their relationships with one another. So it's also just seeing how that ministry flourished outside of anything Tim was directly doing. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thanks for your wonderful talk. You mentioned that Keller was kind of a man without a mentor in his seminary days. And you said that really it's Edwards and Lewis who are his big, mentors.
Yeah.
Do you think that plays a role in how he mentors others?
Yeah, Tim really didn't mentor others. That was just not one of his strengths at all. And perhaps because it was something that he didn't experience himself. But I do want to encourage you in that regard. Some of you are going to be far more gifted or are already in ministry, much more gifted at counseling, much more gifted at one-to-one mentoring or one-to-one evangelism. Those are wonderful gifts that are extremely important in the body of Christ, and they weren't Tim Keller's gifts. They were not Tim Keller's gifts. So I think we, in a 1 Corinthians 12 dynamic, we often tend to highlight those public gifts and diminish, unfortunately, the thriving ministry of those, the not mouth, not gifts, but the feet, basically, in 1 Corinthians 12 in Paul's description there. Tim mentored a lot of other people, but only by far. Like if you feel like me, I kind of feel like I've been mentored by Tim Keller. Well, yeah, because his books, his sermons, all those things do have that kind of spiritual power and ability to understand the soul. He was very attuned to those soul care dynamics. It was very much his own life, his own dynamic in there, and then the study of the Puritans and of biblical counseling. One of his good friends was, he was really good friends in Philadelphia with the CCF folks. They were all kind of the same little group in there. But boy, no, mentoring younger generations of leaders was simply not something that he did well at all. I just talked with Michael, his son, about that last week. So he did mentor him through his gifts, but not one-to-one directly in there. And there probably is a connection.
Thank you so much. You mentioned his non-anxious presence.
Yeah.
Can you speak more about that, especially in his preaching? Was that something that
That's a good one. Yeah.
Came just naturally to him? He was always kind of like that, or is that something that developed over time?
Yeah, I think Josh, you might talk about this so Dr. Chatreau and I have talked a lot about this in Molly Worthen's Conversion, which if you take his evangelism classes, you'll see that paradigm. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look at my Gospel Bound podcast. Molly Worthen, a University of North Carolina professor who recently came to Christ. But one of the dynamics that Tim would often take in his apologetics, and I think you see this come through in his teaching, is he was definitely not threatened by questions. Okay, so he sort of has a very welcoming attitude toward questions. And then beyond that, he kind of had a nonchalant feel about whether you agreed with him. And I'm not saying all of us personality-wise can pull that off. I'm not saying all of us should do that as a missional paradigm for every single scenario. But when he would talk to Molly, he'd be like, believe it or not, whatever. Just like, this is what I believe. This is why I get that. But that's your decision. You need to do that. It wasn't like, I'm begging, I'm pleading, I'm demanding, I'm pushing, I'm cajoling. Again, other personalities might lend itself toward that. But there was a sense in which he could be, that would sort of start with a kind of an analytical perspective, sort of hovering over a dynamic, with one way that he was able to have that non-anxious presence. But then when he walks through a sermon, by the end, he would always say, at the beginning of a sermon, I'm messing up if you're not taking notes. But at the end of the sermon, I'm messing up if you are taking notes. So there would be an emotional engagement that would increase. And so you sort of visualize him on a mountain, and sort of like he's walking down in a sermon. He's kind of starting up on high, assessing the biblical sweep, biblical theology, the background, the cultural situation. But by the end, he's right there in your face. Then there's the pleading sort of coming in there. But it doesn't start there. So there is that dynamic that comes through there. But beyond that, just that non-anxious presence of questions that is something he learned also from R.C. Sproul. So R.C. Sproul did these Gab Fests at Ligonier Valley Study Center, where it was you ask him anything. And by the way, I've seen a lot of pastors tell me, oh, I've been implementing this Ask Anything Gab Fest concept with young people, with my church, and it's amazing when you don't have to have all the answers, but your willingness to sit there and engage with hard questions is one of the most effective things you can do in thriving ministry of any types, especially today in a pluralistic environment. And having some of that sort of like that engaged personality, but also a little bit of nonchalance, and also not knowing everything, but still being authoritative. Tim mastered a lot of those different emotional dynamics in there.
Hey, Collin, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about something you said you were going to talk about, which is, it's great, which is kind of Keller's view of empowering others, view of leadership, maybe lack of administrative skills, some of those things. Yeah,
thank you. One of the points that I excised in there, there was an interesting dynamic with a woman named Catherine Olsdorf, an early convert of Tim's at Redeemer. And she said she would weep with me on the phone saying, I mean, what God has done in my life through Tim Keller. And she would cry there on the phone. And then as soon as she saw me taking notes, she would turn around and say, don't you dare make him out to be a saint. That man really messed a lot of stuff up in the church. We were so angry at him. Tim and I would just go back and forth. He'd say, I was a terrible leader. And I said, there's no evidence in your life that you're a terrible leader, but you are a terrible administrator. And I can attest to that as well. And I've learned some of that myself in my own personality in there. So when you look, about the only two people Tim mentioned to me specifically in New York City who were his friends, and I don't mean that he didn't have other friends, although most of his friends in ministry were from his earlier stops before he was famous. I think there may be some necessity in that as well. There were others like Glenn Kleckner in New York, whatever, but who are legitimate friends. But one of the things that you saw him identify as his friends were Dick Kaufman, who was his first executive pastor, and Bruce Terrell, who was his last executive pastor. And he thought the world of those guys because of how they came in and really saved him from himself. We're not all going to have this experience in ministry, but the revival that started Redeemer and then the post 9/11 period and then combine that with Tim's unusual giftings, they just overwhelmed him. He was drowning in the responsibilities, and the staff felt uncared for, frustrated, confused, all kinds of different things. And God allowed them to come in. But the thing is, I was asking Michael Keller about this recently, and he said, what are those aspects? Like, what do I tell people about why I'm a Christian today and what my parents contributed to that? And he said, number one is, my dad apologized to me. He apologized to me. That's Tim's ministry as well. He was a person who was quick to apologize. He's quick to apologize. And so that does you a world of good with your staff when you're quick to say, yeah, you're right, I did mess that up, and let's try to fix that together. So thanks for asking about that.